I think in Singapore and UAE, the governments have taken the initiative in the start, right? And that's where the regulators have come in. I think once we have true government alignment with the regulators, I feel like Australia will also be very outward thinking in that mindset. And I feel like once that vacuum is filled in, it'll be a really good position to be in.
What comes first is the regulation. We started our preparation from those jurisdictions with the highest reputation of the crypto asset regulation, and also the jurisdiction where they are open to it instead of trying to restricting crypto industry. You know, different from other jurisdictions in US because each state, they have their own rules, right? So if you would like to operate a crypto exchange service or provide crypto exchange, you would have to apply for specific local money transfer license from 40 states out of 50. Because the other 10, you only need to be relying upon a federal level license or registration. But for the rest, you would have to get that one after one. And this is exactly what we are doing because the US is a very big market and we cannot deny it.
What we're seeing globally is some paths to, I guess, unwinding that uncertainty. We've seen in Europe, for example, most recently the UK have introduced a new law clarifying that no, staking isn't a collective investment vehicle. Fantastic. And then that then allows them to create legislation that will allow platforms like Coinbase in the UK to provide staking services. But that really small piece of legislation that just says this is not this is so useful because we don't have to guess anymore. We go, okay, fantastic. And then let's make sure that we're regulating it appropriately afterwards. ESMA has done a relatively similar thing in Europe. They clarified that, hey, staking is actually an ancillary service to custody. Fantastic. So if I'm a custodian, I'm then allowed to offer staking. Simple, I don't need another addition. I think in Australia, it would be great if we could get to a point where we just understand what we're allowed to offer and why.
MAS said, we want to encourage regulation because we don't know what blockchain is going to look like, but we know lots of industry will come from blockchain. So if we've got great regulations and people come to Singapore, they will build those future businesses here and not somewhere else. Nobody is coming to Australia to build a blockchain business.
The uncertainty will just not make Australia an attractive place to do that type of business. We'll push our knowledge offshore. We don't want international businesses saying, great, you know a lot about Australia, everyone's leaving, come here, and then all of our knowledge disappears. And with that, the consequences are for Australian consumers, which is a big part of why licensing is being contemplated in the first place, is consumers need to be protected, they need to be afforded protections like they are under existing financial products and financial markets. They're not going to stop using digital assets because there's no providers in Australia. They're just going to use the providers offshore, and then all of those protections, customers will have to deal with international litigation if something were to go wrong, or rely on protections in other jurisdictions where they may not be as familiar and may not be afforded the same level of protections and consumer disclosures and risk disclosures that are required in Australia.
Digital assets have really been around now for 15 years. They've started to really accelerate in the last 5 or 6 years. And what we've seen is we've seen geographies or countries fall in love with them and embrace them, fall out of love with them, and we understand with some of the crises that have gone through an industry that's maturing, that's caused it, and it's understandable. What we're seeing now though is a divide. If you break up the world and you start to look at different geographies, there are some places that are really doing it well. We're seeing what's happening in Singapore. We're seeing Hong Kong start to open up. We're seeing special economic zones over in the UAE. We're seeing Ecuador. We're seeing all of these places. We're seeing parts of Europe with MiCA and what they're doing up there. So what is happening is talent and money is migrating to friendly jurisdictions that are, quite frankly, giving some certainty. Give industry certainty, give it some rules, and then let industry go and solve the problems and make the world a better place.
Consistency with international best practices from a regulatory perspective is really important when it comes to thinking about offering the opportunity for Australian businesses to scale globally. The extent to which Australian businesses are then able to operate on a global stage is important. Secondarily, I think it's incredibly important for Australia to be seen as a destination for global businesses, especially businesses that have activities in other regulated sectors and other regulated jurisdictions. We want to be able to attract them to Australia to drive the productivity benefits of the digital economy. I think Australia is inherently and traditionally conservative as a business. We're geographically separate from a lot of the rest of the world, and it leads to a systemic tendency to look inwardly as opposed to look outwardly. And I think we can learn from near neighbours like Singapore and other countries like the UAE, Dubai, to actually develop frameworks and activities from a regulatory perspective that allow us to open up to the opportunity of the economic benefits that we're seeing mature globally, and especially in 2025 where the market's maturing, institutional adoption is coming to play. And at the moment, businesses are choosing other jurisdictions with more clarity, with more interoperability in terms of the regulatory environment in order to attract business to their regions. At the moment, Australia is on track to miss out on that opportunity, which is a real shame.
If you've got a business in Australia and you are trying to be competitive on the world stage, and you are trying to foster innovation within your industry on a domestic level as well, it is incredibly difficult when you come up against the barriers that some of the Australian businesses can face because of the fact that there's no clear path for regulation at the moment in Australia. If there is a misalignment in the regulations between one region and another, it means that you are not comparing apples with apples. And it also means that there is a lack of, and I hesitate to say it, but interoperability when it comes to the way that both of those regions would treat a same product. A global alignment is a very important aspect of this whole concept of looking at digital assets and how they're regulated in Australia. I think global alignment is one of the most important factors when it comes to regulators considering how we're actually going to go about this in Australia, because Australia is at the moment on the outside of this, and we are not benefiting at all from any innovation. We're not benefiting, we may be domestically, but we can't export it overseas because we don't have the same standards as other regions. And because there's no global alignment, there isn't any regulatory equivalency when it comes to people being able to be comfortable with a like-for-like regime.
Do we want to be the last post or the last place of resort? I don't think we do. We're sort of heading that way with where we're setting the bar and what the requirements are in terms of licensing and regulation, based on, I guess, the indicators we're seeing in the last 12 months or so.
I think there are two main challenges. One is like the cost of business. And when the cost of business goes up, innovation becomes challenging. And it has a bit of a dual effect, right? Like if it goes up, the innovation becomes challenging, which means you lose your competitive edge and driving jobs and consumer products. Regulation is critical, like for consumer protection, but if it is synergized across the board, across the different jurisdictions, and there's coordination between the different regulators, then you got to do only one implementation, right? We want it. But if every jurisdiction you got to customize, then the cost goes up, okay? And if in Australia goes a very different direction, then it's going to get so cost-driven that, will many of the global companies even come to Australia? Or will companies leave Australia? Consumers are still going to use crypto. The question is going to be like, do we want really well-established companies in Australia servicing Australian consumers? Or do you want offshore companies where we have lesser control from a regulatory front point to service the Australian consumers, where there'll be more harm that could be done? And I'd rather go with the earlier approach.